of that seat! Now! Now!
Officer Ron Clark's shout sliced through the humid, noisy atmosphere of the Route 15 bus. All conversation stopped. Every eye snapped to the police officer standing rigid near the front, his hand hovering over his holster, his rain-soaked uniform seeming to radiate pure anger. It was Halloween night in Philadelphia, and for Clark, it was a night for nuisances. 19 years of experience had taught him to trust his instinct, the same gut feeling that had helped him collar dangerous felons and earned him commendations. That instinct told him to nip problems in the bud. And that instinct was pointed directly at her. He wasn't looking at the drunk teenagers in zombie makeup in the back. He didn't care about them. His gaze was locked onto the 60-year-old black woman sitting quietly in the priority seating. She was too calm, too out of place. His 19-year instinct screamed that this was the problem. He had seen her kind 1,000 times, the quiet ones, the freeloaders, the ones who thought the rules didn't apply to them. He was confident he was right. "Did you hear me, old woman? Get up," he boomed, the command making a child on the bus start to cry. But the very instinct he was most proud of, the weapon he had sharpened for 19 years, was tonight betraying him spectacularly. He had targeted the wrong person, because the woman he was humiliating in front of the crowd, the woman he had just labeled as her kind, was Mrs. Marion Wells, the new executive director of the Department of Transportation. Officer Clark had made his declaration. He began his slow, intimidating walk up the aisle, his boots heavy on the wet floor, his eyes scanning for any other problems. Just then, the bus hit a massive, unavoidable Philadelphia pothole. The vehicle lurched violently, sending the zombie nurse and her Dracula friend tumbling into the aisle, erupting in laughter. "Dude, watch my brains," the nurse giggled, adjusting a fake blood-covered bandage on her head. The sound, mixed with the tinny beat from another passenger's headphones, filled the chaotic space. Amidst this sudden jolt, Mrs. Marion Wells sat perfectly still. She was not, as Officer Clark had already decided, a problem. She was, at that precise moment, simply a grandmother. While Clark was still scowling at the laughing teenagers, annoyed by their noise, Mrs. Wells took a quiet moment for herself. She wasn't wearing her director's suit. She was undercover in a simple worn raincoat and a knit hat, wanting to see the system as her customers did. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an older model smartphone. The screen lit up, illuminating her face in the dim, chaotic light. On the lock screen, a bright, happy photo showed two small children, a little boy, no older than 7, in a beaming Spider-Man costume, and a toddler girl, almost spherical in a fluffy pumpkin outfit. A soft, almost imperceptible smile touched Mrs. Wells's lips. She was thinking about how she'd missed their school parade this afternoon to be here, on this bus, on this rainy night. A pang of regret quickly replaced by resolve. This was why she was here, to make this bus safer for all the other grandmothers trying to get home to their families. She was about to lock the phone when a large shadow suddenly fell over her, blocking the light. The warmth from the photo vanished. She smelled damp wool and the metallic tang of rain on a police uniform. Her smile faded. She looked up slowly. Officer Clark was now standing directly in front of her, looming, his presence radiating impatience and pure hostility. He had seen her, a black woman, smiling at her phone, and his instinct had translated it as laziness, as someone just taking up space. Mrs. Wells calmly, deliberately pressed the side button. The image of her grandchildren went dark. She placed the phone back in her purse. Her private moment shattered, and she met his gaze. Officer Clark did not speak to her. He didn't ask her to move. Instead, he used his authority as a physical object. He unhooked his nightstick from his belt, not in a threatening way, but in a casual display of power. He then tapped the priority seating for elderly and disabled sign on the wall, just above Mrs. Wells's head. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was sharp and deliberate, cutting through the low hum of the bus and the drumming of the rain. It was an act of pure, condescending intimidation. The zombie nurse, who had just climbed back into her seat, fell silent, her eyes wide. Every passenger in the front half of the bus was now watching, holding their breath. "This section is for people who need it," Clark said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. He wasn't looking at the sign. He was staring directly at Mrs. Wells. He put his nightstick back on his belt, his hand resting on it. "So," he said, drawing out the word, "what's your disability, ma'am?" He spat the ma'am like it was an insult, his eyes raking over her simple, worn raincoat. He was implying with no subtlety that she was faking an ailment to steal a seat. Mrs. Wells did not break eye contact. She did not shrink. The warmth she felt for her grandchildren had been replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She had dealt with men like Officer Clark her entire life, in boardrooms and on buses. She refused to be intimidated by him. "I'm just a tired citizen, officer," she said, her voice polite, level, and strong. "Same as everyone else here." It was the wrong answer. Her calmness, her refusal to cower was not seen as dignity. To Officer Clark, it was defiance. It was a challenge to his 19 years of instinct. He saw a freeloader talking back. His eyes narrowed, and a small, ugly smile touched his lips. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, threatening growl that was meant only for her. "Being tired isn't a disability, and I don't like smart mouths. We're going to have a problem here, you and I." Officer Clark's 19-year instinct now had a target. The only thing left was to find a crime to pin on it. He loomed over Mrs. Wells, a smug, menacing presence in the cramped space. The air in the bus felt thick and heavy. The bus driver, Mike, watched the confrontation in his oversized rearview mirror, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were bone white. He saw the quiet older woman, and he saw the officer, and his stomach turned. He knew this kind of cop. This was going wrong, fast. The bus jerked to a stop in traffic, the air brakes hissing. Outside, the bright green and red neon sign of a Wawa convenience store flooded the bus with a sickly, flashing light, illuminating the tense tableau. "All right, that's enough," Clark said, breaking the silence. He had to find a legal reason. His authority had been questioned, and he needed to reestablish it. "Since you're clearly not disabled," he said, the insult hanging in the air, "I need to see your pass. Let's make sure you even paid to be on this bus." This was it. The classic escalation, the accusation of theft. He was in front of a bus full of passengers, accusing this 60-year-old woman of being a freeloader. The zombie nurse and Dracula exchanged a wide-eyed look. This was no longer about a seat. It was a public shaming. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Mrs. Wells held his gaze. She did not sputter. She did not look flustered. Her face was a mask of calm control. "I did pay, officer," she stated simply. "Then prove it," he demanded, his voice rising, "or you're getting off at the next stop. I'm sure your tired legs can handle a walk in the rain." Slowly, deliberately, Mrs. Wells reached into the simple purse in her lap. The passengers watched her every move. Was she fumbling? Was she guilty? Clark crossed his arms, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. He had her. She bypassed her wallet. She bypassed her keys. Her hand closed around a simple, plastic laminated ID on a plain blue lanyard. She pulled it out. She didn't hand it to him. She simply held it up for him to see, the Wawa light catching the official City of Philadelphia seal. "I am a city employee, officer," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Officer," Clark's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of annoyance. A city employee? That wasn't the win he was expecting. He didn't ask for the ID. He snatched it from her hand. The zombie nurse gasped at the sudden, rude movement. The plastic lanyard snapped taut, pulling against Mrs. Wells's hand. But she didn't let go, forcing him to tug it free. It was a small, aggressive act of dominance. He held the ID card up, angling it to catch the dim, flashing green light from the Wawa outside. He squinted. The light was poor, and the text was small. He saw the official City of Philadelphia seal. He saw her photo, a perfectly professional headshot that looked nothing like the tired old woman in the raincoat he saw before him. And then he saw the words, "Department of Transportation." A sneering, ugly laugh escaped him. It was a short, sharp bark of a sound. "Department of Transportation?" he repeated, his voice dripping with condescending sarcasm. He made sure to say it loud enough for the entire front of the bus to hear, turning the ID over in his hand as if it were a piece of garbage. He shoved the card back, not into her hand but at her chest, forcing her to grab it before it fell. "What are you, cleaning staff?" he sneered. "You mop the floors at the depot? Is that it?" This was the line, the ultimate calculated humiliation. He had looked at her, a 60-year-old black woman, and in his 19-year instinct, the only job she could possibly hold at the DIOT was the lowest status one he could imagine. He had relegated her, publicly, to the role of a janitor. The Dracula passenger, a young man in his 20s, who had been watching silently, couldn't hold back. "Man, that's messed up," he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Clark's head snapped toward him. "You got something to say, Count?" he snarled, his hand dropping to his nightstick. "Or do you want to spend Halloween in the drunk tank? Shut your mouth." The young man shrank back, his face pale under his white makeup, silenced. Clark had reasserted his dominance. He turned back to Mrs. Wells, his face triumphant. Clark turned his triumphant gaze back to Mrs. Wells. He tapped her ID card, which she was still holding, with a thick finger. "This ID doesn't mean you get to break the rules," he said, his voice carrying. "It doesn't make you special. You're sitting in a priority seat that a paying customer, or someone who is actually disabled, might need." He gestured vaguely to the rest of the crowded bus. "You're taking up space, and now by talking back, you're causing a public disturbance." He had found his crime. It was flimsy, but it was enough. He was the one with the badge. Mrs. Wells did not look at the ID. She looked at him. Slowly, calmly, she put the card back on its lanyard and tucked it into her purse. She snapped the purse shut. The click sounded unusually loud in the tense silence. She looked up, and all the warmth from her grandchildren, all the patience she had shown, was gone. It was replaced by a cold, hard executive steel. It was a look that had silenced city council members and made contractors tremble. It was a look Officer Clark completely misinterpreted as attitude. "Officer," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "the only person on this bus who is disturbing the public is you." It was not a plea. It was not an argument. It was a statement of fact. The entire bus went deathly silent. The zombie nurse's hand flew to her mouth. The bus driver, Mike, gripped his wheel. He'd just watched a citizen sign her own arrest warrant. Officer Clark's face, which had been pale, turned a deep, blotchy red. He had been challenged. He had been called out. He had been humiliated. This cleaning lady had just, in front of an entire bus, told him he was the problem. His 19-year instinct screamed. "That's it," he snarled. "You're done." He ripped his radio from his shoulder mount. "Dispatch, this is Clark. I have a 1090, a disruptive female, 12th and Market, refusing to comply. I am removing her from the vehicle." He clicked the radio off and looked at her with pure, unadulterated hate. "You're going to jail, Grandma." The mask of procedure was gone. The 19-year veteran was gone. All that was left on the Route 15 bus was a bully with a badge, and he was about to make a 60-year-old grandmother pay for challenging him. The bus at Clark's radioed command had now pulled over to the curb at 12th and Market. His own cruiser, parked behind it, was flashing its red and blue lights, bathing the bus interior in a nauseating, pulsing rhythm. The thump, thump, thump of the windshield wipers was the only sound, counting down the seconds. The passengers were trapped, their faces pale in the flashing lights, forced to watch. Clark, now fully unhinged, pointed to the front door. "Last chance," he snarled, his voice low and vibrating with rage. "Get off the bus now." Mrs. Wells did not move. Her hands, which had been in her lap, were now gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. "Officer," she said, her voice finally shaking, but not with fear, with a profound, controlled anger. "You have not given me one lawful reason for this. I will not be leaving this bus. You are harassing me." The public accusation. Harassing! It shattered the last thread of Clark's control. He saw her not as a citizen, but as an enemy who had publicly embarrassed him. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, so close she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. His instinct was now just pure raw bigotry. "A lawful reason?" he hissed. "How about this? I don't like your attitude." He looked around the bus at the silent, watching faces, and then his eyes locked back on hers. He smiled, a terrible, thin-lipped smile. "This bus, this city, this isn't for your kind." The words hit the air like a physical blow. The zombie nurse let out a sound, "Oh my God!" and clapped her hand over her mouth. At that exact moment, the Dracula passenger's hand came up, his phone's camera lens aimed directly at Clark. Clark saw the phone. Instead of backing down, he escalated. He wanted them to watch. "Go ahead, film it," he yelled, his voice cracking. "Film a police officer doing his job. Show everyone." He turned back to Mrs. Wells, his rage making him tremble. "You see that? Everyone's going to see exactly what you are." He took a deep breath, puffing up his chest, and boomed for the entire bus. "You are a public nuisance. You claim you're city staff? You're a cleaning lady who got lucky with a bus pass, and you dare to defy an officer." He jabbed a finger at his own chest. "I am the law on this bus, and the law says you are a trespasser." The Dracula passenger, his hands shaking but steady, held his phone up. "I'm recording this. You can't say that. You can't call her that," he yelled, finding his voice. Clark, high on his own power, just laughed. "I can say whatever I want, kid. I'm the one with the badge." He turned his back on the passenger, dismissing him. His entire focus, all his 19 years of pent-up anger and prejudice, was now laser-focused on the 60-year-old woman in front of him. His verbal assault was over. Now it was time for the physical one. "You've been warned," he snarled. "I am not moving," Mrs. Wells said, her voice a low, powerful tremor. "Wrong answer," Clark replied. He lunged. He didn't ask again. He didn't warn her. He grabbed Mrs. Wells by the upper arm of her simple, worn raincoat. His fingers dug in, a painful, vice-like grip, pinching the fabric and the flesh beneath. He yanked. A cry of pain, sharp and involuntary, was torn from Mrs. Wells's throat. The 60-year-old woman was pulled bodily from her seat. She was not a large woman, and the force of the pull sent her stumbling, her shoulder slamming hard into the cold, metal pole in the aisle. Her purse, the one with the picture of her grandchildren, was ripped from her other hand, scattering its contents: a tube of lipstick, a small bottle of hand sanitizer, an employee ID across the filthy, wet floor. The entire bus erupted. "Hey! Stop it! Get your hands off her! He's hurting her!" the zombie nurse screamed. The Dracula passenger was yelling, his camera pointed right at the assault. Clark didn't care. He was beyond hearing them. He still had her by the arm, and now he began to drag her, half fallen, stumbling toward the front of the bus. He was going to physically throw her off himself. The bus had become a scene of open, brutal, uniformed assault. Clark, blind with rage, didn't stop. He dragged Mrs. Wells the last few feet. She was breathing heavily, trying to regain her balance, her face pale with shock and pain, but she was not crying. She was, through it all, still watching him with that steel gaze. This defiance, this refusal to break, made him even angrier. He had her pinned against the closed front doors of the bus. The passengers behind them were shouting, their phones all pointed forward, a wall of digital witnesses. He was trapped between the woman he was assaulting and the crowd that was condemning him. He needed an escape. He needed the doors open. He turned his furious, red-faced glare from Mrs. Wells to the only other person with any power, the driver. Mike, the bus driver, was frozen. His heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he thought it might break. He had seen it all in his rearview mirror. He'd seen the verbal abuse, the cleaning staff comment, the racist "your kind" slur, and he had just watched a police officer physically assault a 60-year-old woman. But this wasn't just any woman. He had recognized her from the all-hands-on-deck meetings. He had seen her at the depot, talking to mechanics. He knew exactly who she was. That was Director Wells, his boss. "Open the door, driver!" Clark screamed, his voice cracking with fury. He rattled the door handle, but it was locked to the driver's controls. "Open the damn door!" Mike looked at Officer Clark in the mirror, a man who had become a monster. He looked at Mrs. Wells, his boss, the woman who was trying to fix this broken system, now being assaulted by a part of it. He saw the red marks on her arm where Clark had gripped her. He saw the terror and anger in the passenger's eyes. He knew that opening that door meant throwing his boss to the mercy of this madman. With a hand that was shaking so hard he could barely control it, Mike reached for the dashboard. He didn't hit the door switch. He hit the engine kill switch and the main door lock button. The bus engine died. The thump, thump, thump of the wipers stopped. The interior lights dimmed to the emergency battery. The bus was suddenly plunged into an eerie, tomb-like silence. "No," Mike said, his voice quiet, but in the dead silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. The bus, now a locked, silent cage bathed in the flashing red and blue lights from the cruiser outside, held its breath. Officer Clark was momentarily stunned by the driver's "no." The sudden, absolute silence of the dead engine was more deafening than the passenger's previous shouts. His rage, with nowhere to go, turned into confused, sputtering panic. He had been challenged by the cleaning lady, and now he was being openly defied by the bus driver. He rounded on Mike, who was safely enclosed behind his plexiglass partition. Clark slammed his fist, not his nightstick, but his bare fist on the partition, the impact echoing in the dead bus. "What did you say?" he roared, his voice sounding unnaturally loud. "Did you lock this door? I am a police officer. You open this door right now or you are obstructing justice. You understand me? You're next. You're going to jail right along with her." Mike, who was a man in his late 40s with a perpetually tired face, was visibly trembling. His hands were shaking so hard he had to grip the dead steering wheel to steady them. He was terrified of the uniform, of the man, of the consequences. But in that moment, he was more terrified of what would happen if he did obey. He had seen the director's employee outreach videos. He knew she was trying to make things better, and he had just watched a cop assault her. He took a shaky breath and looked at Clark's reflection in his mirror. "No, sir," he said, his voice surprisingly firm despite his shaking. I can't do that." "You can't?" Clark slammed his fist on the partition again, a crack appearing in the plastic. "I'm giving you a lawful order, damn it." "And I'm following my orders, sir," Mike said, finding a small bit of strength he didn't know he had. My orders are to protect my passengers, all of them, and right now, I'm protecting them from you." Officer Clark's face contorted with a rage so pure it was almost animalistic. He couldn't physically get to the driver, and he couldn't physically throw the woman off the bus. He was trapped. He raised his fist again, ready to shatter the plexiglass partition, to prove that his authority meant something. He never got the chance. A high-pitched, deafening beep shrieked through the bus, so loud that Clark grabbed his ears. The zombie nurse screamed, and the Dracula passenger dropped his phone. It was the sound of a microphone being keyed too close to a speaker, an agonizing feedback squeal. And then, as the squeal died, a voice boomed, not from the driver's seat, but from everywhere. It came from the small grated speakers above the passengers' heads, echoing from the front of the bus to the back. It was Mike's voice, amplified, shaky, but now filling the entire sealed vehicle. "Attention, passengers, and Officer Clark." Clark froze. His fist, which had been raised to strike, was still in the air. He slowly lowered it, his face a mask of pure confusion. What was this? Mike's amplified voice continued, trembling but resolute. I apologize for this delay. We are stopped, and the doors are locked, because a police officer is currently assaulting a passenger." There was a collective gasp. Clark's eyes went wide. What are you doing?" he stammered, his own voice sounding tiny and weak in the face of the booming PA system. He was talking to the partition, but the voice was coming from the ceiling. "He is harassing and assaulting a woman who has done nothing wrong," Mike's voice continued, a new, strange courage in it. The driver had found his power. "Sir," the voice boomed, directed squarely at Clark, "you need to take your hands off her. You need to step away. You are currently assaulting Mrs. Marion Wells." Mike paused for a fraction of a second, a perfectly timed beat that hung in the air. "She is the director of the Department of Transportation." A collective audible gasp sucked the air out of the bus. If Mike's announcement had been a bomb, this was the deafening silence of the immediate aftermath. The Dracula passenger, who had fumbled his phone, quickly picked it up, his hands shaking, and aimed the lens not at Mrs. Wells, but squarely at Officer Clark's pale, horrified face. The zombie nurse's hand was still clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with a look of stunned, almost comical realization. Every single word Clark had said in the last 10 minutes flashed through his mind. 19 years of instinct. This isn't for your kind. You're going to jail, Grandma. What are you, cleaning staff? Director? Clark whispered. The word felt foreign and impossible on his tongue. He looked at the cleaning lady he had just assaulted. He looked at her worn raincoat, her simple knit hat, the scuff on her shoe from where he'd dragged her. It didn't compute. This couldn't be right. Then he looked into her eyes. The change was immediate and terrifying. The 60-year-old grandmother, the disruptive female he had manhandled, was gone. In her place was an executive. The fear, the pain, the slight tremor, all vanished, replaced by a cold, hard, unyielding authority that radiated from her in waves. It was an authority that didn't need a uniform or a gun. It was the absolute quiet power of a person who was completely and totally in charge. Clark's hand, which was still gripping her arm, suddenly felt like it was on fire. He let go of her as if he had been electrocuted, stumbling back a step. "Ma'am, I, he stammered. Mrs. Wells did not yell. She did not cry. She calmly smoothed the sleeve of her coat where his fingers had been. She adjusted her purse strap on her shoulder. Then she looked him dead in the eye. "Officer Clark," she said, and her voice was not loud, but it cut through the dead silence of the bus and carried more authority than all his shouting combined. "You will stand right there. You will not move, and you will give me your badge number, now." The loudest sound on the bus was no longer Officer Clark's voice. It was the sound of a 19-year career collapsing in on itself in the agonizing, rain-filled silence. Officer Clark stood frozen, his face a grotesque mask of pale shock. The flashing lights from outside painted his face red, then blue, then red again. The authority he had wielded just moments ago, the instinct he had trusted, had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a man. He was still staring, uncomprehending, at the woman he had assaulted. "Your badge number, now," Mrs. Wells repeated, her voice perfectly level, cold as steel. I, Clark stammered, his mind racing, trying to find a way out, a way to rewind time. But there was no exit. The doors were locked. The witnesses were filming. The director was waiting. "Badge number," she commanded, her voice rising just enough to add a sharp, executive sting. It's 1842, Clark fumbled, the numbers tumbling out of his mouth, a confession of his identity. 1842. "Ma'am, director, I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know. I thought—" "You thought," Mrs. Wells interrupted, cutting him off, "that I was cleaning staff. You thought I was your kind. I heard you?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The simple, factual statement was a condemnation. She pulled out her own phone, the one with the picture of her grandchildren, and, with a calm, steady hand, began typing a note, her thumb moving purposefully. She typed his badge number. She typed the time. She typed the bus number. Each tap on the glass screen was another nail in his coffin. Clark watched, his breathing shallow. He looked like a man about to be sick. After a long, agonizing moment, Mrs. Wells locked her phone and looked up, not at Clark, but at the driver's mirror. "Mike," she called out, her voice now calm. "Thank you. You can unlock the doors now. We have another officer arriving." Mike, his face pale but resolute, hit the switch. The hiss of the bus door hydraulics opening to the rain-soaked night felt like a final sigh, the opening of a tomb. As the hiss of the door faded, a new figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the flashing red and blue lights. "What the hell is going on here, Clark?" A sharp female voice cut through the air. Sergeant Miller, a 30-year veteran with a face that showed she had seen it all, stepped onto the bus. She was a no-nonsense, tough-as-nails supervisor, and she was expecting to find a riot. Instead, she found a scene that made no sense. A bus full of silent, costumed passengers who looked like they were watching a movie. Her officer, Ron Clark, was standing pale and sweating, looking like he'd just seen a ghost. And in the center of it all was a calm, 60-year-old black woman in a worn raincoat who was looking at her, not with fear, but with authority. Before Clark could stammer a reply, a new voice piped up from the seats. "Ma'am, Sergeant?" Miller's head snapped to the Dracula passenger. He was still holding his phone up, the screen glowing. I got the whole thing on my phone, ma'am," the young man said, his voice shaky but determined. "From the very beginning, from when he called her your kind and the cleaning staff, and when he dragged her." Clark's legs seemed to buckle. He audibly moaned, "Oh, God." Sergeant Miller's eyes, sharp and assessing, went from the phone to Clark and then to Mrs. Wells. She understood instantly that this was not a simple, disruptive passenger. This was a legal and political nightmare. Mrs. Wells turned her gaze to the young man. For the first time that night, her face softened, just slightly. A small, almost imperceptible nod of gratitude. "Thank you, young man," she said, her voice clear and caring. "If you would be so kind, please email that video to the Public Affairs Office at the Department of Transportation. It will be necessary." It was a brilliant move. She had just deputized a citizen, validated his actions, and publicly secured the evidence. The Dracula passenger, now feeling like a hero, nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, ma'am, I will. Right now." Sergeant Miller's face was a mask of stone. She had just heard the words video, your kind, and cleaning staff. She was a 30-year veteran, and she was also a black woman. She knew exactly what those words meant, and she knew what a video like that would do to the precinct, to the city. Her gaze, which had been on the passenger, now moved to the calm, 60-year-old woman at the center of it all. She bypassed Clark completely, as if he were no longer a factor. "Ma'am," Miller said, her voice now clipped and professional, "may I see your identification?" "Certainly, Sergeant," Mrs. Wells replied. She reached into her purse, the one whose contents were still scattered on the floor, and pulled out her official city identification. She didn't hand over the city employee lanyard Clark had mocked. She handed over a hard leather-bound ID wallet that opened to reveal a gold-embossed city seal and her photograph. Sergeant Miller took it. She read the name. She read the title. Executive Director, Department of Transportation. Her eyes went wide, but only for a second. She snapped the wallet shut and handed it back, her movements precise. She had just been handed a bomb. "I see, Director Wells," Miller said. She then turned, her entire body language shifting from investigator to enforcer. She faced her subordinate, Officer Ron Clark. "Clark!" she barked, her voice a parade ground command that made him jump. "Give me your radio, now." "Sarge, I can explain," Clark stammered, his hand instinctively going to his radio. "You will explain nothing," Miller cut him off, her voice like ice. "You will hand me your radio and you will get off this bus. You will stand on the sidewalk by your cruiser and you will not speak to anyone until I come for you. Is that understood?" It was the ultimate public humiliation. In front of the passengers, in front of the woman he had assaulted, he was being stripped of his power, his voice, his very identity as an officer. Wordlessly, his hands shaking, Clark unclipped his radio from his shoulder mount and handed it to his sergeant. He looked at Mrs. Wells one last time, his face a mask of ruined, pathetic disbelief. Then he turned and stumbled off the bus, into the rain, a defeated man. Sergeant Miller turned back to Mrs. Wells, her tone now one of complete, formal respect. "Director Wells, on behalf of the 15th Precinct, I am so sorry. We will handle this." Mrs. Wells just nodded, looking past her, her eyes landing on the pathetic, rain-soaked figure of Officer Clark on the sidewalk. "Yes, Sergeant," she said, "we will." Justice for an audience over 60 isn't always about revenge. It's about balance. The scales had been violently tipped by bigotry, and now, a few weeks later, it was up to Marion Wells to set them right. The conference room at the Department of Transportation headquarters was the polar opposite of the Route 15 bus. It was a bright, sterile space on the 18th floor. Sunlight, a rare gift in early November, streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a long, polished mahogany table. At the head of that table sat Director Marion Wells. She was no longer the woman in the worn raincoat. She was in a sharply tailored navy blue suit, her hair perfectly in place. She was the executive. Across from her sat Officer Ron Clark. He was also in his formal dress uniform, but it was conspicuously missing its gun belt, its badge, and all its insignias of power. He sat ramrod straight, his eyes red-rimmed and fixed on his own hands, which were clasped so tightly on the table his knuckles were white. Beside him, acting as his representative, sat Sergeant Miller, silent as stone. A long, heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the distant muted sound of city traffic far below. Mrs. Wells let the silence stretch, a tool she had perfected in countless negotiations. Finally she spoke, her voice calm and clear in the bright room. "Do you know why you're here, officer?" Clark flinched, as if her voice were a physical blow. He cleared his throat, which was dry. "Yes, ma'am. Director." His voice was hoarse, unrecognizable from the man who had boomed orders on the bus. "Because I made a terrible mistake." Mrs. Wells's eyes, which had been resting on her notepad, snapped up to his. "No," she said, her voice not cruel, but sharp as glass. "A mistake is writing the wrong date on a report. A mistake is a typo. You didn't make a mistake, Officer Clark. You made a choice." She leaned forward, her gaze pinning him to his chair. "You chose to see a 60-year-old black woman on a public bus and assume the worst. You chose to use your authority to humiliate me. You chose to call me cleaning staff." She let that word hang in the sunlit room. "You chose to use the words, your kind." Clark's eyes finally looked up, and they were filled with shame. He opened his mouth, but she held up a hand, silencing him. "Let me tell you about my kind, officer," she continued, her voice low and powerful. "My kind are the nurses, the orderlies, the security guards, and yes, the cleaning staff, who ride the 4 a.m. bus to keep the city running. The very people you are paid to protect. Your instinct, officer, is broken. It's poisoned by prejudice. That is why you are here." Mrs. Wells leaned back in her chair, the simple movement projecting absolute control. She picked up a single sheet of paper from the polished table. The city's legal department, the union, my own staff, even the mayor's office. After seeing that young man's video, they all think I should demand your termination. Clark tensed, closing his eyes. This was it. The end of his 19-year career, his pension, his identity. He had been expecting it. He had been dreading this meeting for weeks. Knowing this was the inevitable conclusion, he braced for the final official words that would make him a civilian. Sergeant Miller beside him remained impassive, but her hands were clasped just as tightly as his. "And I could," Mrs. Wells said, her voice quiet, conversational. She dropped the paper back onto the table. "I have every right. The video is compelling. Politically, it would be the easiest thing for me to do. It would make me look strong. It would satisfy the public's need for a villain to be punished." She paused, letting the silence stretch again, forcing Clark to open his eyes. He looked at her, confused. "But firing you is easy," she said, her voice a shade softer, but no less firm. "It's a quick, clean solution, and it is the wrong one." Clark's head lifted a fraction of an inch. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What would you do, Officer Clark, if I had you fired today?" She asked, a genuine, piercing question. "You would leave this office angry. You would feel you were the victim. You would go home and tell your family that you were fired by some political director who didn't understand the streets. You would hate me. You would hate the system. And in all those 19 years of instinct, you would not have learned a single, solitary thing." She looked past him, out the window, at the city skyline. "We don't need another angry, unemployed man with a broken instinct on the streets. We have enough of those. We need better police." Mrs. Wells slid the single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany table. Sergeant Miller picked it up, her face unreadable as she scanned the typed lines. Clark just stared at it, not moving. "So, here is what will happen," Mrs. Wells announced, her voice leaving no room for negotiation. Sergeant Miller handed the folder to Clark, who took it with a shaking hand. For the next 30 days, as specified in that agreement, which the PPA and your sergeant have already reviewed, you will be on special assignment. Clark looked up, his eyes full of confusion. Assignment? You will report to the 30th Street Station Transit Hub, Mrs. Wells continued, as if reciting a court order. You will work the 4 a.m. to 12 p.m. shift. You will not have a weapon. You will not have a nightstick. You will not have a badge. You will wear a high-visibility civilian security vest, and your job, your only job, will be to ensure the safety of the cleaning staff, the orderlies, and all the other early morning commuters as they arrive for their shifts. You will be their guardian. You will open doors for them. You will help them with their bags. You will learn their names. You will learn to see them as people, not as your kind. Am I clear? Clark, who had been expecting the end of his world, was stunned by the decision. He was being demoted, humiliated, and retrained. He was being forced to see the very people he had dismissed. He realized the profound poetic depth of her lesson. It wasn't revenge, it was re-education. He looked down at the paper, then back up at the director, and for the first time, there was no bigotry in his eyes, only a profound, dawning understanding. Yes, director, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. Yes, ma'am. Crystal clear. The story ends weeks later. A cold, dark November morning, 4:30 a.m. Mrs. Wells, in her professional coat, stands near a coffee kiosk at the 30th Street station. From a distance, she watches. She sees Officer Clark, now just Ron, in his bright yellow security vest. He looks tired, but he is helping an elderly Hispanic woman with her heavy-wheeled suitcase, pointing her to the correct bus and smiling patiently. He sees Mrs. Wells watching. He doesn't smile, but he nods a slow, deep, respectful acknowledgement. She nods back once, before turning and walking to her own car. The scales are balanced. On a rainy Halloween night, it wasn't just a 19-year instinct that was broken, it was a wall of prejudice. This story was never just about the underdog suddenly holding power. It was about how that power was used. Mrs. Wells didn't choose punishment. She chose education, forcing Officer Clark to finally confront and truly see the humanity of the very people he had dismissed. In the end, true justice wasn't served with a termination slip, but with a quiet nod of respect at an early morning bus station, a profound lesson in looking beyond the surface.